Most people think a Social Security COLA is simply a raise. If you're retired, living on a fixed income, or getting close to claiming benefits, the reality is more complicated. A higher COLA can help, but the percentage printed in the headline is not necessarily the amount of extra purchasing power that reaches your household. Right now, one widely watched projection puts the 2027 Social Security COLA at 3.6%. The Senior Citizens League released that estimate on August 12, while AARP's earlier estimate was 3.5%, but neither number is official. The Social Security Administration says the next COLA will be announced in October 2026, after the required inflation data are available. So if you're a retiree receiving $1,500, $2,000, or $2,500 a month, what would 3.6% actually mean for you? And more importantly, how much of that increase could be absorbed by Medicare, taxes, healthcare, housing, and other expenses? That's the part most headlines leave out. Once you see the numbers clearly, you'll understand why a potentially higher COLA matters. But why the number on your Social Security statement is only the beginning of the story. Let's first step back and understand what is actually changing. The 2026 Social Security COLA was 2.8%. For 2027, the latest 3.6% estimate would represent a noticeable increase over this year's adjustment. The Senior Citizens League estimates that if its projected 3.6% COLA were applied to the average benefit it was using, the average monthly retirement benefit would rise by about $69.75 from roughly $1,937.53 to $2,007.28. That sounds meaningful, and for many retirees it is meaningful. An additional amount around $70 a month can help with groceries, utilities, transportation, or a prescription, but there's an important distinction between receiving a larger check and having more financial security. Those are not the same thing. Imagine two retirees. One receives $2,000 a month and spends $1,600 on essential expenses. The other receives the same $2,000 but spends $1,950. A 3.6% increase would add roughly $72 to each person's monthly benefit, but the financial impact would be completely different. The first retiree might have enough flexibility to save some of the increase or absorb higher healthcare costs. The second may simply use the entire increase to cover expenses that have already gone and up. Same COLA, different reality. That's why retirees should think less about the headline percentage and more about their monthly financial margin. Now let's talk about how the COLA is actually determined. This isn't a discretionary bonus that the Social Security Administration decides to hand out. Each year, the calculation is based on a specific inflation formula using the Consumer Price Index for urban wage earners and clerical workers, or CPIW. The law compares the average CPIW for the third quarter with the relevant prior year third quarter average. The resulting increase is rounded to the nearest tenth of a percentage point. The Social Security Administration says the next COLA will be announced in October 2026. That means the current 3.6% projection is not a guaranteed benefit increase. It's a forecast based on inflation data available so far. The final number can still change, and that matters because retirees should not build a permanent spending commitment around a number that hasn't been finalized. This is one of the most important financial habits in retirement. Plan around what you know. Use estimates as scenarios. Don't turn an estimate into a promise. Now let's translate the 3.6% number into a few realistic examples. If your monthly Social Security benefit is $1,500, a 3.6% increase would be approximately $54 more per month. At $2,000, it would be approximately $72. At $2,500, it would be approximately $90. At $3,000, it would be approximately $108. These are simple illustrations before considering other changes to a person's financial situation. And notice something important. The percentage is the same, but the dollar impact depends entirely on the size of the benefit. Someone receiving a smaller benefit gets a smaller dollar increase. That is one reason a percentage headline can sometimes hide the difference between households. A 3.6% COLA may sound substantial in percentage terms, but for a household with very little financial margin, the actual dollar increase may have to cover several different expenses, and this is where inflation becomes personal. The COLA is designed to respond to inflation, but your personal inflation rate may not look exactly like the national inflation measure. If you're spending a larger share of your budget on healthcare, your experience can be different from that of a younger household. If you're paying rent, housing costs may dominate your budget. If you own your home outright, your situation may be very different. If you're helping adult children or grandchildren financially, your household expenses may look completely different again. The same inflation rate can produce very different financial pressure. And here's where the story gets more interesting. A Social Security COLA can increase your benefit, but other parts of the retirement system can change at the same time. Medicare is the obvious example. For 2026, the standard Medicare Part B premium is $202.90 per month. The 2027 premium has not yet been finalized. That's important. You will see estimates and projections circulating, but retirees should distinguish carefully between an official premium and a forecast. The reason Medicare matters is simple. For many beneficiaries, the Part B premium is deducted directly from Social Security. So if your Social Security benefit rises, but your Medicare deduction also rises, the increase in your net payment can be smaller than the headline COLA suggests. This doesn't mean Medicare will automatically erase the COLA. It means the gross increase and the amount you actually have available to spend are two different numbers. That's the number you should care about, your net monthly cash flow. And here's the part almost no one talks about. A retiree can receive a larger Social Security check and still feel financially squeezed. Suppose your Social Security increases by $72, but your groceries, insurance, utilities, medical costs, and other recurring expenses increase by $90. Your income went up, but your financial margin went down. That's why the real question isn't, how big is my COLA? The better question is, after my major expenses change, how much room do I have left? That is a much more useful retirement metric. And this is where two different paths begin to emerge. On one path is the reactive household. A headline says COLA could be 3.6%, and the household immediately treats the expected increase as new spending money. Maybe they add another subscription. Maybe they increase discretionary spending. Maybe they assume the higher benefit means they can safely absorb another monthly payment. The problem is that the COLA is designed to help offset rising costs. It isn't necessarily free cash. On the other path is the strategic household. They see a potential increase and ask a different question. Where would this additional income strengthen my financial position? Maybe it covers part of a rising utility bill. Maybe it helps build a cash reserve. Maybe it reduces an expensive debt balance. Maybe it simply gives the household more room for unexpected medical or household expenses. The difference between those two approaches may look small in 1 month, but over years, small financial decisions can compound. This is especially important in retirement because your ability to increase income may be limited. During your working years, if expenses rise, you may have the opportunity to work more hours, change jobs, or increase earnings. In retirement, you may not have the same flexibility. That makes financial margin more valuable. If you're 62 and thinking about claiming Social Security, don't make your claiming decision based on the projected 3.6% COLA. The annual COLA is important, but it's only one piece of the decision. The bigger questions include when you claim, how your benefit changes with claiming age, how Social Security fits with your other income, how long you may need the money, and how your household would manage different future scenarios. A COLA estimate is not a substitute for that analysis. If you're already retired and Social Security represents most of your monthly income, the issue is different. Your first priority should be understanding exactly how much money comes into the household and where it goes. Don't simply look at your gross Social Security benefit. Look at the amount actually available after deductions. Then compare that with essential spending. That tells you how much financial breathing room you really have. If you're in your 50s and still working, this COLA story should remind you of something even more important. Social Security was never designed to be the only component of a retirement plan for most households. Your future financial position may also depend on retirement accounts, savings, housing, costs, taxes, healthcare expenses, and other sources of income. The more diversified your sources of retirement income are, the less dependent you may be on any single annual adjustment. And if you're carrying credit card debt, the COLA should not automatically become additional lifestyle spending. High-interest debt can quietly consume future cash flow. A few dozen dollars of additional Social Security income can be helpful, but eliminating an expensive monthly interest obligation can sometimes create a much larger improvement in your financial margin. Now let's look at the long-term issue. Social Security's annual COLA and Social Security's financial condition are two different subjects. The 2026 Trustees Report projects that the combined OASI and DI trust funds could have their reserves depleted in 2034. At that point, under the trustees' current law projection, continuing income would be sufficient to pay about 83% of scheduled benefits. That does not mean Social Security is scheduled to stop paying benefits in 2034. It means the projected trust fund reserves would no longer be available to cover the gap between program income and scheduled benefits. And that's an important distinction. The program would still have incoming revenue, but without legislative changes, the projected revenue would not be enough to pay the full amount currently scheduled under law. For today's retirees, this is a long-term policy issue rather than a reason to assume that next monthly check is disappearing. For younger workers, however, it is a reason to include Social Security uncertainty in long-term planning. The lesson isn't to abandon Social Security planning. It's to avoid assuming that every future variable will remain exactly as it is today. That's a broader principle of financial planning. Build around what you know, stress test what you don't, and maintain flexibility. Now let's bring the discussion back to the 3.6% projection. Suppose you're receiving $2,000 a month. A 3.6% increase would mean approximately $72 more. Instead of asking, "What can I buy with the extra $72?" ask, "What problem could the extra $72 solve?" That is a completely different mindset. Could it cover part of a healthcare increase? Could it build a small emergency reserve? Could it reduce a debt balance? Could it help offset utilities? Could it simply reduce the amount you need to withdraw from investments? That last one is particularly important. If you're drawing money from a retirement portfolio, every dollar you don't need to withdraw during an unfavorable market period can potentially preserve more assets for the future. This doesn't mean retirees should stop spending or become excessively cautious. It means additional guaranteed income can be valuable because it may reduce pressure on other parts of the financial plan. And that brings us to one of the most important ideas in retirement planning. Sequence matters. The amount of money you have isn't the only thing that matters. When you withdraw, it matters. When markets fall, matters. When healthcare expenses occur, matters. When Social Security begins, matters. When taxes are due, matters. A small increase in guaranteed income can sometimes provide flexibility in those decisions. But again, the key is not to overstate what a 3.6% COLA can accomplish. It's helpful. It's not transformative for every household. Now, what should you actually do this week? Start with your current Social Security statement or benefit information. Write down the monthly amount you actually receive. Then calculate what a 3.6% increase would mean for your specific benefit. You can do the math yourself. Multiply your monthly benefit by 0.036. That's your approximate monthly increase if the final COLA were exactly 3.6%. Then multiply that result by 12 to estimate the annual increase. Next, create a second number. Calculate your essential monthly expenses: housing, food, utilities, insurance, healthcare, transportation, debt payments. Don't worry about making it perfect. The goal is to understand your basic monthly requirement, then subtract those expenses from your reliable income. That is your approximate financial margin. Now run the calculation again with the projected increase. If your margin improves significantly, that's useful information. If it barely changes, that's also useful information. It tells you that your household may need to focus more on expenses and reserves than on the COLA itself. Next, look at your Medicare and healthcare costs. Don't assume the 2027 figures are already final. They aren't. But do recognize that healthcare expenses can change and that your Social Security benefit should be evaluated alongside those costs. Then review your debt. If you have high interest balances, consider whether additional income should first strengthen your cash flow rather than increase discretionary spending. After that, review your emergency savings. A retiree doesn't necessarily need to follow a one-size-fits-all emergency fund rule. Your needs depend on housing, health, income sources, family responsibilities, and access to other assets, but having accessible reserves can reduce the need to sell investments or borrow when an unexpected expense appears. And finally, if you're nearing retirement, look at your entire income picture: Social Security, retirement accounts, savings, pensions if applicable, housing, taxes, healthcare, and your expected spending. The goal is not to maximize one number. It's to create a retirement system that works together. Because here's what can quietly happen over time. A retiree receives a COLA. Expenses rise. The retiree spends the entire increase. Another year passes. Another COLA arrives. Expenses rise again. The household never actually increases its financial margin. The check is getting bigger, but the household isn't becoming more secure. That's the trap to avoid. A COLA should ideally help preserve purchasing power, but financial security comes from the combination of income, expenses, savings, debt, taxes, and flexibility. That's why the percentage alone isn't enough. Now let's talk about loss aversion. People naturally focus more on losing money than gaining it. A retiree may be thrilled to hear about a 3.6% increase, but become much more concerned when a monthly premium or bill rises by $20. That's normal, but a better financial approach is to look at the entire system. Don't ask only what you're gaining, ask what is changing around that gain. If Social Security rises by $72, but expenses rise by $50, you are still ahead by roughly $22. Before considering other factors, if expenses rise by $90, your margin is going the other direction. This is basic arithmetic, but it can completely change how you interpret financial headlines. And that's why retirees should avoid both panic and complacency. Don't assume the 3.6% estimate solves your retirement problem. But don't dismiss it either. For a household living on a tight budget, even a modest increase can matter. The smart response is to understand exactly where it fits. Now think about your future self. Imagine yourself 5 or 10 years from now. Your Social Security benefit may be higher, but your expenses may also be higher. Your healthcare needs may change. Your housing situation may change. Your investment portfolio may experience good years and bad years. The goal today isn't to predict every one of those events. It's to make your future self less vulnerable to them. That's what financial planning really is. It's not fortune-telling, it's preparation. And the good news is that small improvements can compound. Reducing one unnecessary recurring expense, building a little more cash, paying down expensive debt, maintaining consistent retirement contributions while working, reviewing your tax situation, understanding your Social Security options. These actions may not produce dramatic results next week, but over years, they can widen the difference between financial pressure and financial flexibility. So where does the 2027 COLA story stand today? The latest widely followed projection is 3.6%. That is above the 2.8% COLA for 2026. But it is still only a projection. The Social Security Administration will announce the official 2027 COLA in October after the required inflation data are available. And that's the number you should ultimately plan around, not today's headline, not a forecast from a private organization. The official number. Until then, think in scenarios. If the COLA is around 3.6%, what changes? If it's somewhat lower, what changes? If healthcare costs rise more than expected, what changes? If your investment returns are weaker for a few years, what changes? A resilient financial plan can handle those questions without panic. And that is the bigger lesson. Retirement security isn't created by one good COLA. It is created by maintaining enough margin that one disappointing year doesn't destroy your plan. The Social Security COLA is one piece, Medicare is another, taxes are another, housing is another, savings and investments are another, debt is another. The strongest households understand how these pieces interact. So if you're a retiree watching the 2027 COLA estimate, don't just ask whether 3.6% is good or bad. Ask what it means for your household. If you're receiving $1,500 a month, what would an additional $54 mean? If you're receiving $2,000, what would $72 mean? If you're receiving $2,500, what would $90 mean? And then ask the more important question, how much of that increase would actually remain after your essential expenses? That number tells you far more about your financial position than the headline percentage. Because a bigger Social Security check is helpful, but a bigger financial margin is what creates security. And if you can use even part of a future COLA to strengthen that margin, you're doing something much more powerful than simply increasing your spending. You're giving your future self more choices. You're reducing the chance that one unexpected expense forces a bad financial decision. You're protecting your retirement plan from some of the uncertainty that comes with living on a fixed income, and over a long retirement, those choices matter. So don't panic. Don't assume everything will be fine automatically, and don't make major financial decisions based on an estimate that hasn't become official. Instead, use this period to prepare. Know your benefit. Know your expenses, know your healthcare costs, know your debt, know your tax situation, and know how much financial margin you actually have. Because when October arrives and the official COLA is announced, you'll be in a much better position to understand what that number means, not just for your Social Security check, but for your life. And that's ultimately what this story is about. Not a percentage, not a headline, not a prediction. It's about purchasing power, financial flexibility, and the ability to remain confident when the cost of living keeps changing. So here's the question I'd like you to consider. If the 2027 Social Security COLA ends up around 3.6%, what would make the biggest difference for your household? Covering higher healthcare costs, reducing debt, building savings, or simply having more breathing room each month? Share your answer in the comments. And if you want clear, data-driven updates on Social Security, Medicare, retirement planning, inflation, taxes, and the financial changes affecting American households, consider subscribing. Because the most important financial number isn't always the biggest number in the headline. Sometimes it's the amount that remains after everything else is paid.